Welcome, everyone. I'm Walter Sterling, the president of St. John's College, Santa Fe, and thank you. One more round of unusual applause because of the weekend's events. It's been a very full weekend. A month or so ago, I started calling it the inaugural Olympics we were preparing for this weekend, but we trained for this. So we've had many wonderful events over the course of the weekend, and very excited to conclude with this lecture this afternoon. This is the third event this weekend that we're holding under the rubric of a new program we're calling the Buchanan Forum, funded by a generous gift from a local friend of the college. Shiloh Brooks' conversation on Friday evening, our alumni panel yesterday, The Life of the Mind at Work in the World, and now our lecture and conversation with Musa al-Gharbi, We Have Never Been Woke. The Buchanan Forum is named after the founder of our academic program in 1937 in Annapolis, Scott Buchanan. And I'm going to read one more time, since these are all being recorded separately, a tribute to Buchanan and then a few sentences about what our vision is. And this came from an in memoriam talk by the great scholar at the University of Chicago, Richard McKeon, who was broadly speaking part of the same national movement for great books education, core education, liberal education, and their renewal in the early part of the 20th century. Scott Buchanan was a teacher and a learner, a man of doctrine and of discipline in the ancient senses of those two words. He adapted the themes and topics of the history of thought and action to the circumstances of concrete experiences and to the problems of present emergencies. And he sought liberating arts and regulating disciplines to guide men in the specification and in the use of the possibilities of imagination and the ideas of wisdom. And that's from McKeon. Since 1937, students and faculty at St. John's College have sought to meet the challenges that face our country and liberal democracies around the world by reading and discussing the books that form the roots of our civilization. The goal of the Buchanan Forum at St. John's College is to expand the reach of the college's founding vision of worldly engagement grounded on liberal education. Our goal is to reach anyone who seeks a thoughtful life amid today's rapid technological, cultural, and political flux. To that end, the Buchanan Forum will offer a wide variety of both public-facing lectures and colloquia and smaller, more intensive programming. So we're delighted to have you all here as part of the inauguration of this forum with these three events this weekend, and in that spirit, and again to welcome especially many members of the local community perhaps back to this building and back to campus for this event and others this weekend. The format is going to be that Professor al-Gharbi will give a talk for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll go right in to questions from the audience. I think, are we going to set up 2 microphones as we've been doing? And after about 45 minutes of that, around 5:30, we'll adjourn here, and Professor al-Gharbi will go downstairs, directly downstairs to the bookstore, where he's happy to sign copies of his books, have some more conversation for a bit after that, and we have copies available for purchase there if you'd like to. And there are refreshments available, and they should still be out there after in the hall after the talk. I'm going to say a couple personal words about, I'll call you Musa now, if I may, and then my colleague, tutor Marzora Shukla, is going to introduce him more formally. I met Musa at the Heterodox Academy annual conference in 2024. I won't say much about it, but if you're not aware of the Heterodox Academy, you might want to look into it. But I didn't know who he was before that, but he was offering a workshop before the conference for academics who are trying to write for popular audiences. And I registered for that and did that workshop with him, and I could see right away what a gifted teacher and scholar and writer and author he was, and I benefited enormously from that experience. But it turned out at that same conference that there was a kind of preview of this book that turned out to be so widely read and reviewed, and a provocation in many ways, as well as a great work of scholarship. And I got to see on in a plenary session, Musa and Jonathan Haidt, who many people are aware of from his books, The Anxious Generation, Coddling of the American Mind, and so on, have a colloquy about their latest books, or in this case, the forthcoming book, and that was a very dynamic and interesting conversation. I got to have lunch with Musa afterwards, got to know each other some, and I just thought from that moment, I really looked forward to having the opportunity to welcome him to St. John's. There are many things about his work and his way of thinking, including a certain interdisciplinarity that I think is just natural to him, that makes him a good fit for St. John's. But in the spirit of things that we've heard over the last couple of days, right, we've heard the category of intellectual courage invoked a great deal about what we ask for, what we cultivate among our students. And I think Musa is a great example of intellectual courage and intellectual integrity, which is maybe a phrase that I haven't heard as much the last couple of days, but it's been implied, deeply implied by so much of what we heard, and it's something I admire greatly. And I consider him a gentle and generous thinker, scholar, teacher, and writer. So I'm very grateful that he's here. He's going to be returning to spend a week with us during Summer Classics this summer. And with that, I will now ask my colleague Marzor Shukla to come up and give him a more formal introduction. So again, welcome to you all.
I'm so very happy to welcome Musa al-Gharbi to St. John's College. Mr. al-Gharbi is a sociologist and assistant professor in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University on Long Island, where I grew up. He is a columnist for The Guardian, and his writing has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic, among other publications. He's also the author, and most relevant for today, of We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite, which came out in 2024 from Princeton University Press and has been praised as probably the most incisive and interesting book that has been written on wokeness. As the Atlantic Monthly declares, al-Gharbi is neither an adherent of wokeness nor an anti-woke scold. Rather, his work is distinguished by its focus on questioning the function of reigning orthodoxies and pieties through careful empirical work and fair-minded analysis, all with an eye to addressing actual social conditions. And I can't wait for the conversation. So please join me in welcoming Musa al-Gharbi.
All right, so I'll put one microphone away, turn on this one, get my coffee so I'm not low energy, and let's see, fun preview there. All right, so this is going to be a little bit of an unusual talk because one of the things that Walter challenged me to do a little bit before I came here today was to try to connect the book and the arguments of the book to what happens here at St. John's. And so what I thought it would be a kind of a fun way of getting into a little bit the arguments of the book would be to start by, would be to go over some of the thinkers that have kind of really influenced my thinking and my work and that find expression in this text. But before that, I'll just start by saying I kind of inadvertently cobbled together a very St. John style education. I feel very envious when I've been talking to the students and talking to the tutors about what you do here at St. John's. Like I feel a lot of envy, like if I could do my life over again, it would have been great to have gone here. But, so like as a quick run through, I'm not gonna explain each and every one of these things on the screen, but if you're curious about any of these things, I'm happy to talk later. But basically, I started my life and my kind of intellectual life, I guess better said, really interested in questions of theology. Then I ended up getting a bachelor's degree in Middle East Studies. I got a master's in philosophy. And then I was teaching political science at University of Arizona. Then I got canceled by Fox News and lost that job. And managed to fail upwards to Columbia, where I studied sociology. And that's what my PhD is in. And now I'm a professor of communication and journalism at Stony Brook University. So, you know, I just kind of did all the disciplines. And one of the things that that unites a lot of my work, like if you look at me on paper, if you look at my CV, you know, I have papers I've done looking at the use of statistics in the Syrian civil war, looking at how sociologists and journalists analyze Trump and Trump voters. I have a piece on social science in the Islamic Commonwealth period. I have like a wildly heterogeneous looking CV. But one of the things that unites both, that's kind of carried through across these different disciplinary sectors that I've been a part of, and that kind of ties throughout my work, is I've long been kind of possessed by these questions about what do we actually know, and in virtue of what? How do human beings produce knowledge together? And when we do produce knowledge together, well, what then? What happens then? Like, how and in which ways is knowledge ultimately put to use? Like, what's the social life of these knowledge economy outputs? And so this set of interests really ultimately culminated in the creation of this book. It's kind of a funky book in a lot of ways because it doesn't fit well into a particular discipline. It's very methodologically and theoretically ecumenical. I have wonky stat chapters, I have historical chapters, I have theory chapters, I have cultural sociology chapters. Kind of each chapter I adopt a kind of importantly different method to try to get leverage on the question that chapter is trying to explore. So if I'm gonna, so I'll just briefly walk through some of the intellectual currents that express themselves in the book. So like most immediately, the book owes a big debt to Pierre Bourdieu. So Bourdieu was a sociologist from France. He was from a kind of working class, non-traditional background. And at first, when he entered the French Academy, he was treated with a lot of disdain and disrespect by his kind of fancier urban peers. And this created this kind of hatred. I guess hatred is too strong of a word. A deep resentment and suspicion towards the institutions that he was part of, and towards his colleagues, that really informed a lot of his sociological methods. So he became this really important critic of knowledge economy professionals, and pioneered a lot of important sociological theories and methods to study the production of knowledge and culture, and the people who produce it, and the ways that they use their outputs. So in his book on Manet, for instance, Bourdieu explored the drivers of what he called symbolic revolutions, which were these kind of rapid changes in how people talk and think about certain issues, these kinds of radical culture shifts. So this is a question, this is a type of phenomenon that my book is also interested in exploring. Now, my specific explanation of the so-called Great Awakening, this kind of period of rapid cultural and political change that happened between 2010 and roughly 2021. My explanation of what's going on there, of what the drivers were of this moment of heightened change and contestation, it kind of rhymes with what Bourdieu argued. It's not quite exactly the same. I draw from some other influences, but his ways of thinking and analyzing this kind of question about like periods of rapid cultural change and institutions of cultural production deeply influenced my own thinking. He also had a book called Homo Academicus that in some ways even prefigured the critique that I would later make. So writing in the 1960s, what Homo Academicus is trying to explore is, what he explores is how a lot of academics in that time were aligning themselves with racial liberation, with feminism, with all of these other social justice causes, but in the process of doing this, they were also leveraging these claims to being on the side of the marginalized and the disadvantaged in their struggles over power and resources and opportunities, often in ways that did precious little to help the people that they were claiming to help. So my book expands a little. At the time Bourdieu was writing, there had only been one previous awakening, one of the sort that he was trying to analyze in that book. Writing from my current historical vantage point, as I'll discuss in a moment, there have been four. And so the fact that there have been, I have a lot more cases to work with, allows me, I hope, to get some more interesting, some deeper leverage on some of the questions that he was trying to explore in that book. And I also kind of explore to a broader range to a broader spectrum of knowledge and cultural elites. He was focused purely on academia. My book does focus on academics, but also on journalists, on consultants, on people who work in finance, and so on. And then finally, in his book, Distinction, Bourdieu introduced this really important sociological concept, a concept of symbolic capital. So symbolic capital is the resources that elites draw upon to make inequalities seem natural, normal, inevitable, reasonable. He identified a few important sources of symbolic capital that have, since his death, have just kind of, like, sociologists come up with new forms of symbolic capital, like left and right. It's kind of a fun thing to do, I guess. That's not my bag. So for the purposes of my book, I just kind of stick, well, a lot with Bourdieu's initial formulation. But one of the ways in which distinction really influences my approach to this work in a really fundamental way is that the group of people that the book is focused on, I actually draw from his verbiage here. So the we, and we have never been woke, is an elite constellation that I call symbolic capitalists. I call them symbolic capitalists because they make a living based on what they know, who they know, and how they're known. That is, they make a living by cultivating and leveraging symbolic capital on behalf of themselves and their clients. So a slightly less nerdy way of describing who symbolic capitalists are is there are people who make a living based on symbols and ideas and rhetoric. There are people who manipulate, who don't provide physical goods and services to people. So people who work in fields like consulting, finance, law, HR, academia, journalism, and so on. These are all examples of symbolic capitalists. If you're in this room, there's a pretty good chance you're a symbolic capitalist. If you're a student here, there's a pretty good chance you're an aspiring symbolic capitalist. About 9 out of 10 college graduates go on to work in the symbolic professions. I am myself a symbolic capitalist in two senses. I'm a journalist, I'm an academic, well, in at least two senses. I'll just stick with those two for now. So symbolic capitalists, they've been known by other names. They've been called the professional managerial class, the creative class, a lot of classy terms. It's kind of in the weeds to explain why I don't prefer that verbiage. If you're curious about that, I wrote a Substack that kind of goes into that, and I'd be happy to discuss it in the Q&A. But when you look at symbolic capitalists as a group, we're kind of funky compared to most other Americans in a lot of ways. And we're just kind of really unique compared to the rest of society in a number of ways. One way in which we're unusual is in the deep ties, that symbolic capitalists have with narratives about social justice. So if you look at public opinion polling, for instance, the folks who dominate the symbolic professions are the same size. Like if you look at who it is in America that's most likely to self-identify as an anti-racist, as a feminist, as an environmentalist, as an ally to LGBTQ people, and so on, it's us. It's not just us who personally identify this way, but our institutions that we're part of often identify with a lot of these causes quite explicitly. In terms of our ideological lean, symbolic capitalists overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly identify as liberal, left, progressive, something that sees not right wing. And politically, we're overwhelmingly and increasingly tied to the Democratic Party. and in other countries, we're also increasingly and overwhelmingly aligned with left-aligned political parties. So this isn't just a US feature. Many of our professions explicitly define themselves in terms of altruism and the common good. So for instance, as a journalist, my job is to speak truth to power and to be a voice with the voiceless. As an academic, I'm supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads, and to tell the truth, to speak the truth without regards to anyone else's political or economic interests and so on. A lot of our professions, law and so on, have canons, psychology, have canons that explicitly define themselves in terms of altruism and the common good. And this is not incidental. From the beginning of our professions, like if you look at symbolic capitalists compared to most other workers in America, one of the ways in which we're unusual as well is we get a lot more pay than most other workers. We have a lot more autonomy than most other workers. So we don't have bosses typically micromanaging us, tracking our time, telling us exactly what we need to be doing. We have a lot more discretion in terms of, we have a lot more autonomy. We also have a lot more social prestige. Our jobs have a lot more social prestige than other. We expect and deference and so on. And from the beginning of our professions, the kind of social contract that was made explicit, and again, in a lot of the professional canons, was that the reason we have this pay, this autonomy, and this prestige is not for our own sake. No, never for us. But the idea was, if you give us these things, it will better empower us to help everyone in society, including and especially the least among us. Which is to say, from the beginning of our professions, our bids for power and status and autonomy were bound up with these claims about social justice. And so that fact helps give rise to kind of the core puzzle that the book is trying to explore. Namely, given how we think of ourselves, given how we define ourselves, given how our professions justify themselves and so on, what you might expect is that as people like us gain more power and influence over society, we'd see all these good things happening. What I show in the book is that starting in the period between the two world wars, and then accelerating especially after the 1960s, there were these significant changes to the global socioeconomic order that radically enhanced the position of symbolic capitalists in society relative to pretty much all other social stakeholders. We have a lot more power and influence over society. Now again, given how we understand ourselves, what you might expect is that as we get more power and influence over society, you might expect to see inequality shrinking. Because, we're these altruistic people who are committed to redistribution, and we have all this wealth that's in our hands and under our influence, so presumably it would be getting redistributed. So you'd expect to see inequality shrinking. You'd expect to see maybe long-standing social problems getting fixed. You'd expect to see growing trust in institutions because of all the good work that we're doing. People would love institutions, they trust them more. This is not what we see. Over the last 50 years, instead, we've seen growing inequalities, growing institutional mistrust and dysfunction, growing affective polarization. Long-standing social problems have persisted and gotten worse. And so the core puzzle that the book is trying to figure out, basically, is what's going on here? Why do we see the world we actually live in, rather than the world we might have hoped or expected, the world that previous cohorts of symbolic capitalists promised? If you just give us more power, if you just give us more autonomy, more resources, all these good things will happen. Well, we got the more power, we got the more autonomy, we got the more resources. Consequences have not been what we had predicted. So trying to figure out what's going on here was, on the one hand, an empirical question that was tied out to a bunch of long-standing nerdy interests that I've had for a long time. But it was also kind of it was also very deeply an existential question. The core question that I was I'm basically trying to wrestle with over the course of this book is like, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? What am I doing here, right? Because at the time when I was writing this book, I had transitioned from being a shoe salesman in a small town in Sierra Vista, Arizona, to being an Ivy League intellectual. And I was there at Columbia University for the same reason that everyone else was there at Columbia University, with probably the same mix of drives and motives, aspiring to the same types of careers. And here I am as a tenure-line professor with a six-figure salary at an R1 research university, right? And so these questions, they weren't just intellectual questions. They were existential questions. One of the things that's kind of striking that I talk about a lot on my Substack, I have this series that I've been doing. I kicked off the new year with a series about how, the process of researching and writing this book was deeply disorienting to me. It really changed the way that I think about a lot of social issues. And so I have, so in the series I've so far explored how these transformations, for instance, have led me to rethink profoundly how effective, for instance, it would be to address a lot of these issues, to vote for Democrats, vote out the Republicans, what kind of mileage does that add? And one of the reasons that I talk about in this essay and in the book, one of the reasons that really led me to question this was, if at the time when I was writing this book, when I started this whole adventure, if you had asked me, who's responsible for most social problems, I would have said two things. I would have said the millionaires and the billionaires and those damn Republicans. Okay. Then I moved to, and I was from this small military town in Arizona, very conservative family. I was kind of the black sheep. My mom always introduces me to people as her liberal son, which is funny because that's not the way I'm coded. And, context is everything. But then I found myself in Manhattan. And, again, when I was growing up, I was like, oh, man, if only people in Podunk, Arizona could be more like the enlightened denizens of New York. Oh, what a great country this could be, And I moved to New York, and I was like, ugh. And one of the first things that really jumped out at me is that, okay, well, actually, I'll move beyond the anecdotes that I observed, because I described them in the book. But if you just look at the kind of macro data, what you see is New York has immense concentrations of wealth. One of the largest concentration of millionaires and billionaires in America. It's the center for publishing, one of the top centers for publishing in the whole world, one of the top centers for media in the whole world. It's home to multiple Ivy League institutions and also a lot of other great colleges and universities, and so on and so forth. It's reliably blue, overwhelmingly blue. The mayor of New York is a Democrat, and that's usually the case. The city council is I think it's it's more than 2-to-1 Democrat. The state legislature is 2-to-1 Democrat. The governor is a Democrat. Both of our senators are Democrat. One of them is the minority leader. Our House delegation to the federal government is Democrat, including Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader in that chamber. So, overwhelmingly, uniformly, democratically controlled. And yet, New York, despite having tons of wealth, also has one of the highest poverty rates in the nation. It ranks really low for social mobility, racialized, and it has the most segregated school systems in the country. And when I was trying to figure out, well, why is New York like this, where you walk through immense amount of human suffering all the time you're confronted with? Why is New York like this? Well, one answer that I couldn't give is those damn Republicans. Because those damn Republicans are pretty much irrelevant to the politics of New York City and, for the most part, actually New York State. And since, I'll just say, I wrote this book before the 2024 election, but one thing that's been very clear since the 2024 election, for whatever it's worth, is that on a lot of these issues, to the extent that you would have expected the Democrats to provide some kind of meaningful opposition or check on the executive or something, good luck. And it's not, and so like, so my views on partisan politics changed a lot. My views on crime actually changed a lot. And I have an article coming out tomorrow about how my views on redistribution have also evolved and become a lot more complicated than they were. Not the least because, again, my assumption is like, to solve social problems, you just tax Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, take the money and give it to people who need it. That sounds great. It would be great. It would be great. The problem, though, is us. This is what I argue in the problem is, it's actually tough to just take money from Jeff Bezos and give it to people who need it. What ends up happening is money gets taken from wealthy people and put into institutions that we control. We eat most of it and then kind of sprinkle the crumbs on the poor. And unless until that changes, my colleague Matt Desmond, for instance, at Princeton, he has this book called Poverty by America. And what he shows is that for every dollar that's earmarked for the poor, only 25 cents actually gets to the poor. And so you could argue that poor people are better getting that 25 cents than if they didn't get that 25 cents. But it's just a really inefficient way of solving social problems to keep taking dollars from certain people and allocating them to the poor and then having us eat most of it and sprinkle the crumbs on the disadvantaged. And so, again, over the process of researching and writing this book, my views on a lot of issues changed. I really put myself at stake in a way, and you have to. In my opinion, good work, good scholarship, you are putting yourself on the line. I mean, one of the quotes that kind of rattled through my brain a lot was this one from James Baldwin from No Name on the Street, where he says, "The truth is a two-edged sword. If you're not willing to be pierced by that sword, even to the extreme of dying on it, then pretty much all of your intellectual activity is just a masturbatory delusion and a wicked and dangerous fraud." I agree with him on that. And so I really tried to live that in the book. And one of the ways that that commitment expresses itself over the course of this text is methodologically, is through my commitments to reflexivity and analytical symmetry. Now, reflexivity is the idea that an argument that you make about society writ large or institutions writ large should also apply to you and to the institutions that you belong to and to your friends and your neighbors and your lovers. So for instance, a lot of people say, people, they're just shaped by these biases and they're motivated by these interests and they have all these unconscious drives and all this kind of stuff. And we're sociologists are really happy to accept this view of the world of other people. But then we think of ourselves as somehow being Kantian individuals who kind of make free choices based on our own. So we have this, and there's a lot of other tendencies like this. And so one of the things that I really tried to do over the course of this book is not do that. Is to take the same kind of argument that I make about other people and other institutions and apply it to my own institutions, apply it to myself. In fact, one of the ways you can understand the project of this book, really, is, one thing that comes through quite clearly in the text is that my thinking was deeply shaped by critical race theory, by post-colonial theory, by queer theory, by feminist standpoint epistemology. One of the ways to understand what I'm doing in this book is taking the arguments of those literatures to what I view as their logical conclusion, which is to say, if we think that ideologies function a particular way, that the composition of fields profoundly shapes the knowledge that gets produced, that there's all these claims made on behalf of justice that often don't represent or serve the populations that they're supposed to be serving. If we think this is true of ideologies in general, why should we think that our own preferred ideologies are any different? Why should we think that our ostensibly social justice-oriented narratives function any different than any other ideologies? Do they? That's an empirical question that I try to answer in the book. Analytical symmetry is about analyzing different groups in the same way as often as possible. So there's this tendency in social science, for instance. One phenomenon that you see a lot. There's a whole bunch of empirical literature that shows people prefer to sort with other people who are similar to them. And they treat people who are similar to them better than they treat other people, typically. This is true, empirically, this is true. If you look at LGBTQ people prefer to hire and work with other LGBTQ people. People who are Koreans prefer to hire and work with other Koreans and live in neighborhoods with other Koreans and marry other Koreans. This is true. Women are much more likely to hire and promote and favor other women. Any kind of axis that you want to look at, you see this trend towards homophily express itself. So it seems to be a general human tendency. Now, this is not how it's analyzed, though, in the social sciences. Instead, what sociologists tend to do is we'll look at the same kinds of behaviors and analyze them in radically different ways depending on who's doing it. So, for instance, if black people prefer to hire and promote and work with other black people, we tend to analyze that through the lenses of social solidarity and extending social capital, and these behaviors are praised. If white people engage in the exact same behaviors, they're analyzed through a completely different repertoire, through the lenses of white supremacy and prejudice and bigotry, and those same behaviors, those same tendencies are villainized, that are praised in this group. So analytical symmetry sounds like it's not that spicy, but when you do it, it's pretty spicy. And so one of the things that I do in this book is I try, if I'm critiquing billionaires, I don't critique people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and exclude people like Jay-Z and Oprah, who are also billionaires. If I'm analyzing the, anyway, so this commitment to analytical symmetry is something that comes through strongly in the book. It was influenced by a different sociologist, Bruno Latour. He has a book visualized on the screen called We Have Never Been Modern. And what Latour argues in that book is that the stories that modern people tell ourselves about what separates us from other people, these stories, they actually obscure the nature of the modern world, and they make it difficult for us to understand and address the problems that accompany modernity. So my book, We Have Never Been Woke, is a nod to his book. What I argue in my book is that the stories that symbolic capitalists tell ourselves about how we're allies for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, about how we're on the right side of history and so on, these narratives actually obscure how a lot of social problems come about and persist, who benefits from them and how, and it makes it difficult for us to achieve the social goals that we're ostensibly committed to. Now, one of the things that's been kind of cool in the reviews is it's really great when someone who reads your book really sees you, and understands. So my work was deeply influenced by Soren Kierkegaard. He had a profound influence on shaping my thought. And I had read a collection of his essays that's often published as Attack Upon Christendom a while ago. They weren't in the front of my mind, probably, when I was writing the book, although I do mention Kierkegaard and other points. But this reviewer, one of my favorite reviewers, a political theorist, Matt McManus, flagged that correctly, that he said, reading my book reminded him of Kierkegaard's. He said, in this polemic, Kierkegaard did something more shocking than either rejecting or offering apologetics for Christianity. He insisted, in fact, there's very little Christianity in the world. What passed under the name of Christendom was a mockery of Christianity. Self-professed Christians would ceremoniously mouth the words of the creed, surround themselves with religious symbology and rituals, but their faith was nothing of the sort. it was tied to the all too human needs of psychological stability, or worse, they were aligned with the vulgar forces of petite bourgeois moralism and conservative nationalism. A creed that had called on its followers to give up everything and follow Christ had become an opiate consoling the alienated middle class, boiled down to an injunction to donate a little money every Sunday, followed by prayers for the king and the country. Kierkegaard lamented that in a Christendom of hundreds of millions, there might not be the single real Christian. He notes that I'm less, harsh than Kierkegaard, but it's a very similar kind of argument, actually, in a way that I hadn't thought about when I was writing it, but almost certainly this didn't, incidentally, another philosopher who has deeply influenced my thought is Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, in The Antichrist, made a very similar kind of argument, that the word Christianity is itself a misunderstanding, that there's pretty much only been one Christian in history, and he died on the cross. My own book closes with Jesus, actually, because the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, even though I'm no longer a Christian, still deeply influence my thinking. So the book closes with Matthew 6, where Jesus admonishes people to be aware of practicing their righteousness in front of men. You shouldn't be praying out in public for everyone to hear you, these grand epic prayers. You shouldn't be donating and showing people how you're donating and what a good guy you are. You shouldn't be, when you fast, you shouldn't be like, oh gosh, I'm fasting. Ooh, pray for me, guys. You shouldn't be. He says, if this is what you're doing, you already have your reward. What you're actually interested in is social plaudits and stuff. You have them, congratulations. But what you're doing is actually meaningless with respect to God. You're doing the gestures, but you don't have the spirit. And in this same chapter, Jesus admonishes people that you can't serve two masters. That you have to be, you'll either be devoted to one or despise the other. You can't, in fact, serve two masters. You can't serve God and wealth at the same time. That's, my book closes, and I'll explain kind of the relevance of that last line in particular in a moment. But my book closes with Jesus. So there is a real sense in which McManus was picking up on some kind of deep-laid architecture that I wasn't even thinking about, probably as I was writing it. But my book opens with Nietzsche. And so, some tonal whiplash here. So one of the arguments that Nietzsche made that really influenced how I approach these issues, Nietzsche argued in The Genealogy of Morals that there's no set of maxims that's more important than this. That the actual causes of a thing's origin and its eventual uses, the manner of its incorporation into a system of purposes, these two things are worlds apart. That everything that exists, no matter what its origin is periodically reinterpreted by those in power with fresh intentions, in the course of which the earlier meaning is often obscured or outright lost. Now, the way that quote, and Nietzsche's work more broadly, influenced my approach to studying these issues is that, a lot of the books about, quote, wokeness are really focused on texts and ideas. So there's a lot of them that try to genealogize the origins of various strains of social thought and so on. To my mind, this approach that's really focused on texts and ideas is kind of a dead end. It's a dead end, for one, because, as Nietzsche aptly argued, what's often described as wokeness often has very little relationship to the texts that are supposed to have created these sets of ideas or practices. So, for instance, a common idea that's associated with wokeness is the idea that women, black people, LGBTQ people, and so on, they have some kind of unique insight into society. They speak more truthfully about society. They're more altruistic. They're kind of morally and epistemically superior to the straight white men. this kind of a thinking is often attributed to Patricia Hill Collins, who formulated in her book, Black Feminist Thought, she formulated this framework called the matrix of oppression. Now the thing though, is that if you actually read Black Feminist Thought, Patricia Hill Collins says, now you might think, based on what I've just said, that women might have some, that women and black people and so on have some kind of special, unique insight into society, that they're more moral and so on. You might think that. You're wrong. This is not the case. All of us have partial and situated knowledge. All of us, black people aren't magical creatures. They're people just like white people are people, driven by the same kinds of mix of motives. They also have limitations. They're also fallible morally, epistemically, and otherwise. She said the way that you get access to the truth is by putting the dominant and the subaltern perspectives into conversation with each other. This is how that collectively we can produce something that looks like comprehensive, reliable knowledge. Now this is very far cry from the idea that, oh, what needs to happen is the straight white men just need to be quiet, and we just take the books by the straight white dudes and we just burn them in a pyre and read books by other people instead. So there's this wide gap between a lot of these views and narratives that are associated with wokeness and what the actual people who are associated with those views argued. Marx is commonly associated with this idea of equality of outcomes. A lot of people who are really in favor of equality of outcomes sometimes call themselves Marxists or attribute their views to Marx. And this is wild because Marx wrote whole treatises like the Critique on the Gotha Program, where he explained that equality of outcomes was an absurd and undesirable political goal that could only be achieved through inhuman ends. But a lot of the people on either side of this culture war, both the people who make these narratives about, ignore the dead white man, equality of outcomes, a lot of the people who make these kinds of narratives, and the people who are criticizing those people, neither one of them have actually read the books that they're evoking. In fact, if you want, this is one of the ways in which St. John's is unique, because a lot of you, hopefully almost all of you who are tutors and students at St. John's, when you evoke books, you will have read them. They kind of force you to do that in a way that other colleges do not. In fact, if you want to really be distressed about the state of education today, I might recommend this essay from my Substack, where one of the things I show is, like, according to a lot of right-leaning narratives, educational institutions are indoctrinating a bunch of young people by shoving down their throats Marx and Foucault and all these other radical thinkers. Okay, the problem with this is that, one, actually there's a great data set called the Open Syllabus Project that lets you see what's assigned in classes around the country. And what you see is that actually you can take any of the radical, like Foucault is probably the most, Foucault and Marx are some of the most widely assigned people, but even they are only, even if you restrict yourself to humanities and social sciences syllabi, they're only assigned in a pretty small percentage of syllabi. And in order for the indoctrination thesis to be true, it has to be the case that people are assigned the text, then people read the text, which, again, if you look at the data, very few people who are assigned texts in most institutions actually read it. There's a lot of great data on this. In fact, the more elite you go, the less likely that students are to read them, because the grading gets softer the more elite you go, and so on. So they have to not just be assigned it and read it, but then also understand it and be persuaded by it to the point where they're actually willing to change their behaviors and political alignments and so on. Now, the share of people, the share of students who check all of those boxes is like, it's a rounding error. Almost no. In any event, for the purposes of my book, what was important to me was not to genealogize a bunch of texts. What was important to me, instead of the arguments or the ideas per se, was the social life of these arguments, the social life of these narratives. What ends do they serve? And for whom? And what role do these narratives and these texts and these arguments serve in the world? In a similar way, the book doesn't spend a lot of time focusing on the contents of people's hearts and minds. Instead, I'm focused almost exclusively on things that can be observed from the outside. What do people say? What do people do? How do people allocate their resources, including their time? What are their relationships? These are often much better indicators of what people value. So you can have a commitment that's sincere, but not very important to you. If something is important to you, you make time for it. If something is important to you, it changes your other commitments. So looking at people's behaviors tends to be provide a much richer insight into what people actually care about and how much they care about it than trying to, psychologize people and get into the contents of their hearts and minds. Another big influence on my work, especially as it relates to that, was the sociologist Max Weber. So Weber, like Nietzsche and Marx, insisted that ideologies are often a reflection of people's social standing, that they're often used in the services of a bunch of political and economic and other ends. Weber conceded all of that. But one of the things that made him unique was that he argued that ideas don't just reflect people's interests, but they can also transform how people understand their interests, what their interests are. They can transform how people pursue their interests. And they can ultimately end up exerting their own independent force in the world that's often very different from what their progenitors of those ideas would have anticipated or foreseen. So, famously, he has a book on the Protestant work ethic that kind of explores how this set of beliefs about predestination and God's favor ended up ushering in this kind of bureaucratic rational capitalism, such that today, a lot of people who are not Calvinists, who have never read anything by John Calvin, who are not Christian, who, they nonetheless behave as Protestants, and they have to, because of how societies and institutions have been subsequently structured and so on. So what I do in my book is I look at how a set of ideas that were originally derived from the social gospel movement came to define a set of professions, the symbolic professions, giving rise to these unique forms of competition over status and power and resources and opportunities. This is because, as I described in the first chapter, a lot of our professions, like academia, law, and so on, were originally created as basically sinecures for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. And people who were not that were largely excluded from the professions. A lot of universities excluded Jewish people for a long time. African Americans, all the way until Adams v. Richardson in 1973, 19 states in America had segregated school systems. My own father went to segregated schools his whole life through K-12, and even when he was getting ready to go to college, it was the first year he could go to the white school, which was the state university. He tried that out, and then he quit and joined the army. It wasn't his thing. But in any event, a lot of our professions were created literally as sinecures for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, especially men, and they're deeply informed, both the kinds of narratives that they make, the ways that they're kind of structured, is deeply informed by this genesis. So in the book, I look at how this set of ideas from the social gospel movement came to define the symbolic professions, and how today a lot of these narratives that have evolved over time within these professions about social justice and emancipation and so on, how a lot of these narratives, these egalitarian claims, are actually mobilized by contemporary elites to justify inequalities, to explain why it is that the winners in the prevailing order deserve to succeed, deserve power, deserve deference, and why the losers, the people who are falling behind and so on, deserve their lot too. Oh, you're suffering, you're marginalized, well, you're a racist. You should be. What? We need to be concerned about the suffering of racists and sexists, and so on. Now, one thing that I took from Weber and emphasized here that I think is a novel contribution that a lot of people still, I stress this throughout the book, but in some of the reviews and commentary, it seems like people couldn't pick this up because it goes against a very ingrained set of tendencies. But one of the things I stress in the book is this argument that I make in the book about how symbolic capitalists often marshal these social justice narratives in the service of their interests. This isn't to say that symbolic capitalists are cynical or insincere. There's no mustache-twirling villains in this book. In fact, like in the discourse, we have this tendency to think that either someone is sincere or they're using something instrumentally. And so there's this whole set of moves that people do where they go, ha ha ha, you have an interest in believing something, you have an interest in arguing something, therefore you must be cynical, you've been exposed. And I think that's a really bad way of thinking about thinking for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being that our brains are kind of fundamentally wired to perceive and interpret the world in ways that flatter our interests and serve our goals. And the reason our brains are structured that way, this is actually a feature, not a bug, as I explain in this essay. So right now, for instance, I'm being bombarded with tons of information. I can try to keep track of how many people are in the room, how many people have brown hair, how many people have gray hair, how many people are men, how many people are women, how many tiles there are in the ceiling, how many lights there are. I just have all this information that I'm being bombarded with. I can't possibly keep track of it all. I can't possibly attend to it all. I can't remember it all. It wouldn't be valuable to me if I could. And so we have to make these decisions on what to focus on what to retain, on how to fit the things that we're observing together into a coherent picture. And we don't just do that in a random or disinterested way. We do it in ways that help us advance our interests and further our goals. And this is actually adaptive. But when we talk about our interests, another contribution of Weber is that unlike Marx, he didn't understand interests to be purely material. So, we do have material interests that we all pursue, that all human beings pursue. Food, water, sex, the kind of basic human needs. But what Weber argued is in addition to those kind of material interests, which are pretty universal, we also have these ideal interests. Ideal interests like the desire to love and to be loved in turn. The desire to create something that survives you, to be part of something bigger than yourself, to be loved and respected and integrated into a community. These are all, these ideal interests, Weber argued, are really, really, really important too. In fact, they're so important that people are often willing to sacrifice their material interests in the service of their ideal ones. Soldiers go die to protect a country. Firefighters rush into buildings to save other people in their community. Now, sure, they're getting paid to do that, but you can get paid a lot of different ways. You're not rushing into a burning building purely in the pursuit of a paycheck. And so one of the things that I stress throughout the book is that when I talk about how we mobilize these social justice narratives in the service of our interests, I'm not just talking about our material interests, I'm also talking about our ideal interests. And one thing that's also important to note about interests that Weber stressed, and that's just important in general, is that almost no one thinks of their interests in purely individualistic terms. When I think about what my interests are, I think about my children. I think about my wife. I often think about my neighbors, sometimes my co-religionists. People who only think about their own individual interests are abnormal. We even have words for them like sociopath. That's just not the way that almost anyone thinks about their interests or pursues their interests. And so what I argue in the book is not that symbolic capitalists are a bunch of selfish, cynical, people who are marshaling this stuff out of dark motives in their heart or anything like that. The argument I make in the book, the answer to the central question that I posed at the beginning, or one of the answers, the cultural contradiction that informs a lot of the other ones I explore, is that symbolic capitalists, we tend to have two sets of sincere commitments that are in a fundamental tension. On the one hand, when we say things like, we want the people at the margins of society to live lives of dignity and inclusion. We want the people who are suffering to be uplifted. This is not cynical, it's not insincere. When people were crying after George Floyd was killed, like that was a performance, but it wasn't just a performance. People were actually sad. So these commitments we have to egalitarianism, while sincere though, are not our only set of sincere commitments. Most of us are also sincerely committed to being elites, which is to say, we think that our perspectives and our priorities should carry more weight than the people checking us out at the grocery store. We think we should have a significantly higher standard of living than the people who deliver packages to our doorsteps every day, and we want our children to reproduce our own social position or to do even better than us. This set of commitments is also very sincere. We aggressively pursue those commitments. And they're in fundamental tension with each other because you can't actually be an egalitarian social climber. What would that even mean? And so what I argue in the book is that when these two sets of fundamental commitments come into tension with each other, as they often do, it's often our desire to be an elite that ends up winning out and transforming how we pursue a lot of these social justice goals. So we end up mostly pursuing them in ways that don't cost anything for us, risk anything for us, require us to change anything about our own lifestyles and our own aspirations. And this is a problem, as I show in the book, because it's actually basically impossible to achieve a lot of our expressed social ends that way. One of a verse from the Quran that kind of haunted me while I was writing this book is from the second surah. And it goes, they would deceive God and those who have attained to the faith, but they deceive none but themselves, and they perceive it not. In their hearts is a disease, and so God lets their disease increase, and grievous suffering awaits them because of their persistent lying to themselves. And when they are told, do not spread corruption on the earth, they answer, oh, but we're just improving things. Verily, it is they who are spreading corruption, but they perceive it not. And when they're told, believe as other people believe, they answer, what, should I believe as the fools believe? As I was researching and writing this book and reading the Quran, this one really jumped out at me and kind of cut me to the quick because as a symbolic capitalist, one of the things we often think is exactly this. What, should I believe as the fools believe? Oh, all of these other people, there's misinformation, disinformation, ignorance, not like me, I'm educated. Again, we define ourselves in terms of altruism and the common good, but as I show at length in the book, we are actually responsible for creating and perpetuating. We're some of the primary beneficiaries of a lot of the social problems that we condemn. And we're not like passive beneficiaries. We are very active in exploiting and exacerbating a lot of these social problems. And another thing that's really striking when you look at public opinion polling is about how they deceive none but themselves, but perceive it not. One of the things I show in the book, in chapter 4, I have this section called Tempest in a Teacup, where one of the things I show is like, there's this increasing symmetry between the people who are producing knowledge and cultural outputs in America is this narrow and idiosyncratic slice of society. And increasingly, it's that same narrow and idiosyncratic slice of society that's pretty much consuming all of those outputs. Like, we're mostly talking to ourselves. Pretty much the only people that we're convincing is ourselves. In fact, you can see this very clearly in public opinion polling. Working class people, for instance, tend to resent people like us more than they resent the millionaires and the billionaires and so on. Most Americans, if you look at most black people and ask them, as Pew did a large sample of African Americans and asked them, do you feel as if the racial reckoning in recent years did anything for your life, did anything to improve the prospects of African Americans? Overwhelmingly, black people answered no. Highly educated black people were more likely to say yes. And highly educated white people were very likely to say, were significantly more likely to say yes. So there is this kind of, okay, and then the last thing I'll talk about as it relates to the method of this book, what I'm trying to accomplish in the book. One of my big projects was to try to discipline a lot of these conversations on culture. So in the discourse, there was a lot of conversation that something big changed in recent years, that something big changed after 2010. Now, a lot of these narratives were kind of based on vibes and anecdotes, like something would happen at Middlebury College and cue like 1 million histrionic columns in the New York Times about how it's the end of Western civilization and kids these days and so on. My working assumption as a sociologist is that if there had been some kind of significant transformation in culture, well, it seems like we should be able to like measure it. And so, alongside my colleagues, I set about to measure, did something change, has something changed? So for instance, this graph is from a study where my co-author and I, we analyzed 27 million news articles from 47 media outlets over the past 50 years. And what we saw is that starting after 2010, there was this rapid spike in conversation about prejudice and discrimination. All forms of prejudice and discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, you name it. Just pew, 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 hockey sticks all at once. You saw it in left, right, center media. It didn't seem to correspond to anything happening in the world. The shifts predate, for instance. The shifts on misogyny predate the Me Too. The shifts on race and concerns about racism predate the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, it might be that part of the reason these movements were able to succeed, well, were able to have a bigger impact than other movements who had been trying to address a lot of these same social problems, is because they happened to occur during this period of already heightened concern within the symbolic professions about a lot of these issues. So I have a lot of graphs that I produced, that my colleagues and I produced, studying this in epic scale. We looked at changes in video games, changes in movies and television programming, changes in policies by employers, changes in political alignments, changes in protest activity, and so on. I couldn't put all these graphs in the book because Princeton was like, nah, it's kind of awkward for formatting, and it like runs up the page numbers, and anything in color is just really expensive. So the book doesn't have a bunch of graphs. But if you want to see a bunch of graphs, I have on my website an essay called "The Great Awakening is Winding Down," where I include a lot of the graphs showing that this period of change that we saw after 2010 seems to have peaked around 2021, so before the re-election of Donald Trump, and has been in consistent decline. So anyway, looking at all these empirical measures, what I discovered was, first, there was a shift. There was a there. Something changed. Something changed in terms of political activities, something changed in terms of outputs, something changed in terms of affiliations, how people identify the race, gender, sexual identifications that people say. Like something changed after 2010. But the changes were not broad-based. It wasn't the case that all Americans changed or most Americans changed. And it wasn't the case that these were bottom-up changes, that it was like working class and poor people and minorities and other disadvantaged people who changed, and then later the elites and the well-advantaged people shifted in response to the grassroots activism. It went the other way. In fact, it didn't even go very far the other way. It was almost exclusively us that changed. You didn't see a lot of changes in many other institutions, among most other stakeholders in societies. And one of the other things I noticed is that the shifts were actually a case of something. So, a lot of the discourse just assumed that we were living in unprecedented times, these breathless takes about how nothing like this has ever happened before. And maybe it's because of my religious orientation or something, but Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. I was alive to the possibility. Probably not as unprecedented as people think, and then in any event, so when we did these analyses, we did analyses of pretty long time series, and one of the things that became very clear is that, in fact, this period of shifting and heightened contestation around social justice issues within the symbolic professions that we saw after 2010, it was actually a case of something. And there were 3 previous periods of awakening prior to this one. There was one in the 1920s through the early 30s. There was one in the mid-60s through the mid-70s. There was one in the late 80s to the early 90s. That was the last time we had these blow-ups around what we called political correctness at the time, but today we call wokeness. And we had this one after 2010. And if we understand this as a case of something, then we can compare and contrast these cases and get leverage on questions like, well, why do these awakenings happen? Why don't they go on forever? Do they change anything? What do they change? And so that's the project of chapter 2 of this book. And I'll just, as a bit of a spoiler, I can tell you that on the question of why do these awakenings happen, it's not kids these days, it's not social media, it's not civil rights law, as Hanania and some others have argued, and it's not like the emergence of postmodern, like Foucault and Derrida, and so, because again, there was an awakening in the 1920s before any of these people were doing their thing. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions. If you want to access some of those essays I have, my Substack is Symbolic Capitalism. My website is there. It has my email, my socials, all that stuff. Thank you for your time.
So we'll set up a couple of microphones and just sort of go back and forth, take questions for maybe about a half hour.
Yeah.
Hi there.
How you doing?
Thanks so much for, I think, opening my mindset to a different angle and the use of sociological analysis and objective data to look at this phenomenon, I think is so interesting because it's so polarizing. And I find myself just reading your title, it's like, where should I stand on this?
Yeah.
And I have, so I'm coming from having worked in an academic culture and being really frustrated by the siloedness of it all. As you were talking, there were a couple things that came up for me. The changing of the gatekeepers. I think to a great extent there's a valid critique of we need to change the gatekeepers if people are going to have opportunity and have their voices heard. But in the course of doing that, I wonder if from a cultural framework, initially going from one monolithic ideology, that was our model. And so maybe we're seeing an adaptive process, but we need to get to the next step. Because we don't want to just imitate the oppressor. We want to, evolve past that to establish a broader society. So this issue of the siloedness, I bring back to meaning creation. When I was working on my doctorate in education, I looked at Lev Vygotsky a lot, who talks about the social roots of our language and our creation of meaning together. And so the challenge that posed to me, and continues, I think, to be a major challenge, is how can we, in contrast to what we do here, coming from many perspectives to create that integrated conversation and the life worth living, if you will. When I got here, I had a chip on my shoulder, and I thought I knew a lot, and then that Socratic bug bites us, and we realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm doing exactly what I'm critiquing them of doing, and this is not, this is not the goal. But then through this collective, the ability to engage diversity, I think over the course of the weekend, the idea of a conflict or difference being a creative tension in a way, that this is an opportunity for us to question ourselves and grow, and to reach, I guess what I'm getting at, yes, there is a question. To get at a change, you say there are no villains, and I'm glad to hear that, but how to move forward together past the perception of villains. You work in the academy now. I guess I'd like you to address that idea of is there a way forward in a conversational framework? Can we create structures that create the opportunity? Structure is so important here.
Yeah.
We're in a siloed academy. You enter into it and you're expected to perform in a certain way. So we need to create new structures where we bring together people around a different disciplinary kind of table, I think, to broaden this. And people from different classes who maybe aren't the kind of symbolic capitalists that the elites are interacting with. So I'm just thinking, is there a structure that we can move towards that's going to help us get through this to something more transformative?
Yeah, so one of the things that comes through a lot of the empirical literature is that, like, one of the problems, so for a lot of people, if they think, okay, I'll use this anecdote better. I was on this panel on polarization in the United States. There were 4 people who were African American who were part of this conference. One of them was a Jamaican. Actually, 2 of them were Jamaican. One of them was a Kenyan, Nigerian recent immigrant, and then there was me, who was half white. There wasn't a single person on the panel who was from a non-immigrant background who didn't have at least one white parent. And now, the vast majority of African Americans did not look like the panel. But these kinds of distinctions are often elided in symbolic capitalist spaces. We go, oh, we have some black people up there. They can just represent the black perspective. And when people are curious about, like, well, what do African Americans think about crime, for instance? They often don't conduct or consult nationally representative data. They don't go out to the community and, like, interview local stakeholders. They go, oh, well, what do the black columnists at the New York Times say about this? And this is a big problem. This is a big problem for a number of reasons, not the least because the kinds of people who become writers at the New York Times tend to be radically unrepresentative of a lot of the populations that they ostensibly speak on behalf of. In fact, there's this essay that tortures me, honestly. It's an essay by Bertrand Cooper. It's called Who Gets to Create Black Culture? And in this essay, Cooper invites us to imagine a world where George Floyd doesn't encounter Derek Chauvin that day. And so he lives. He doesn't get killed in the street. And he says, now imagine this living George Floyd. Gets into his mind that he would like to write for the New York Times, or he would like to produce a special for HBO, after he died, George Floyd, all the media, Nancy Pelosi donned a kente cloth and, like, took a knee, George Floyd. Okay. So he says, imagine George Floyd, living George Floyd, wanted to write for the New York Times. Would he be able to? And the answer to that question is no, absolutely not. He didn't have a college degree. The New York Times and institutions like it don't give one whit what people like George Floyd think about anything. Their perspectives are totally absent from the newspaper. And even since the death of George Floyd, there are George Floyds all around this country today. Are their perspectives represented in the New York Times and the Washington Post or any of these other outlets that cared so much about George Floyd? No. Until George Floyd was killed in the street in a very public way and became a symbol that we could use in our struggles over status and resources and opportunities, up until that moment, he was invisible. And after he stopped being useful to us, who talks about George Floyd today? Nobody. And this kind of a tendency I mean, there's just so much work on, like, one of the ways in which a lot of these efforts to diversify go awry is it tends to be only people from the most advantaged members of the target group that tend to benefit from a lot of these programs. And the last thing I'll say is that a lot of the initiatives that are supposed to help marginalized and disadvantaged people often alienate them instead or jeopardize their positions. So for instance, last anecdote, and then I'll stop talking. There's this great study in the Harvard Business Review by Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Koliv, two sociologists. And what they find, what they want to explore, is what happens when companies create anonymous reporting procedures, anonymous grievance procedures. The idea behind a lot of these systems is that people from non-traditional backgrounds in institutions, they often don't know how the institutions work, they don't know what the levers are to pull, they don't feel as comfortable, seeking authorities, creating problems. And this is true, there's a lot of research on this. And so the idea is if you create an anonymous reporting system, it will allow these folks to have their grievances addressed and heard. Okay, that's the theory. How does it work in reality? Well, what Koliv and Dobbin show is that after companies create these anonymous reporting systems, there's no effect at all on white male managers. They're not more likely to get fired, they're not more likely to get sanctioned, there's just no change at all for white male managers. There's a slight negative effect for white female managers. There's a larger negative effect for non-white female managers, and there's an immense negative effect on non-white male managers. They become much more likely to get fired and punished when institutions create these anonymous grievance procedures. And on the one hand, that might be a surprising finding, but it's actually kind of intuitive when you think about it. Because if you think about who is it that's least likely to know what the right things to say are and to say them in the right time, in the right way, who is it that's less likely to know the right social scripts and conform to the institutionally dominant norms? It's going to actually be people who are from non-traditional and underrepresented backgrounds. And so when you make it easier to punish people who go off script, that's going to disproportionately negatively affect people from the, and in fact, a kind of perverse consequence of setting up these anonymous reporting systems is that when reporting systems are not anonymous, a lot of people from the dominant group are reticent to bring complaints. They don't want to be the guy who goes and gets the black manager in trouble. That's not a good look for you as a white, But when you create this anonymous reporting system, people from the dominant group can report all day, and they don't have to worry at all about reputational stuff, so they can just aggressively police people from anytime they kind of, and so there's a lot of these, one of the things that drives me batty and that informed a lot of my work on Heterodox Academy is there's this tendency for people to either care a lot about viewpoint diversity, so they're concerned about the lack of political and religious and other kinds of perspectival diversity in the academy. The people who are fired up about that cause tend to be really dismissive about other forms of diversity and inclusion. And on the flip side, people who care about race, gender, sexuality approaches to diversity and inclusion tend to be really skeptical or dismissive about the concerns for viewpoint diversity. But these are actually intimately interrelated and mutually reinforcing problems that have to be addressed in tandem. If you just focus on one or the other, you're going to be engaged in a kind of self-defeating process. Okay, I'll stop talking now.
Can we go back and forth?
Yeah.
Okay, you maybe touched on this at the end of that, but I think I'm understanding this recognition of the idea of symbolic capitalism and how that really does not help marginalized communities. I think I'm less clear on what is the actual solution or movement towards helping those communities. How do you get out of this, I think you called it the tempest in the teacup situation, how do you get out of that regurgitation? How do you actually move into the solution?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a spoiler and maybe a bit of a disappointment. But one of the ways that that a lot of people structure books, spend about 6 chapters describing a problem, and then the concluding chapter, it's here's my solutions. So my book doesn't end that way. It ends on a kind of willfully unsatisfying note. And I had to, I had to fight for that, actually. Princeton really wanted me to answer that question, because it's a really uncomfortable read for people that raises all of these questions about, well, what are we doing here? How should we live? What should we do? The problem is, one, by the end of writing this book, I was just like, I didn't feel confident that I had answers to those questions. Also, what the book actually is, though, is it's this 100-year look at the political economy of the knowledge profession. So it also seemed a little bit like a non sequitur for me to go, okay, here's my 100-year look at the political economy of the knowledge professions that ends with a checklist for effective steps for social justice advocacy. It just seemed like a non sequitur. And then lastly, and I think selfishly maybe, there's a tendency sometimes to take someone like me and kind of make me into push them into being kind of a guru for kind of anxious white liberals, I guess. I can't find a more delicate way to say that. I didn't want to be the next, the anti-Kendi, or I didn't want to be that. I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates didn't want to be Ta-Nehisi Coates, in the way that he ended up becoming Ta-Nehisi Coates. He did these interviews in The Atlantic where he's like, I don't know how I became the person that white people point to show that they know something. And I don't, and he was really frustrated at The Atlantic because, they stopped really editing him. He could just write whatever he wanted at unlimited length, and everyone was just like, give me more, oh, you're so smart. And he hated that to the point where he quit. He quit this well-remunerated, high-profile job just because he hated this. And so I didn't want to be that. And I realized that one of the best ways to avoid being a guru is to decline to give out advice. But this is but this created some tension. So I was at this one talk where as soon as I finished, there was this kind of beeline of folks to the microphone. And they all asked the same question. It was like a 2-minute lead up to what was basically the question that they had for me was so they would introduce all the good things they do, how committed they are to social justice as a build up to the question, which was, so I'm good, right? We're good? I'm good? And I was I'm not in a position to be yes, on behalf of the blacks, you're a good person. I'm not in a position to give them that kind of absolution, so I declined to do that. And they often reacted really negatively. This one lady literally screamed at me, politics, well, what would you have me do? And I was I wouldn't have you do anything. Again, I wrote this book analyzing the political economy of the knowledge professions from the interwar period through the present. If you want advice, there are priests, there are imams, there are self-help sections in this bookstore. That's just not that's not the book that I wrote. And so I think it's healthy and good. And as you read the book, it'll raise these really, like it did for me, it'll raise these really profound, intense questions. I don't have the answers to them, unfortunately. At this particular stage in my life and life journey, I don't have the answers to them, and I don't want to lie to you and pretend like I do. Okay, I'll stop talking now.
Hi, Musa. First of all, thank you for a great talk. You gave us a lot to think about, a lot to chew on, which is what I look at your talk being about and your book being about, not necessarily about answers, right?
It's descriptive rather than prescriptive.
Yeah, exactly. But there is something that really comes to mind, and I apply it to my own life, which is just like you, I look at my group of friends. They're all multi-degreed people, multi-educated people. They're people that are intellectual elites, okay? I live in Santa Fe. I grew up in Colorado. I was born on the East Coast, and 90% of my friends are from the East Coast, okay? Just like you moved from Phoenix to the East Coast for probably similar reasons. But what I find is to be very frustrated with some of the things you brought up is how ineffectual we are to create change. Even though we think we're smart and we can read books and understand ideas, one, and two, how insular the group is, right? And if we continue to be so insular, to the lady that first spoke, we can't make change.
Yeah.
And I find that to be getting even worse rather than better because, for example, to use you as an example, or Glenn Greenwald, right, who you know, writing for The Guardian, or Chris Hedges, who used to write for the New York Times, two of my favorite intellectuals. You guys are all on Substack, right? You can't even get to the New York Times anymore. It's drifted right.
Oh, I can. I just don't want to deal with editors.
Well, but you know what I mean? To get information, you can't get it on mainstream media. It's getting worse and worse and worse, right? So my question is, how do we get to a broader platform where not just 100,000 people are on your Substack, but 1 million people are watching something that makes a difference?
Yeah. Well, and so the thing about the New York Times, too, is like one of the things I counsel people a lot, people who are like interested in influence, is like, so even the New York Times, if you look at the readership of the New York Times, it's growing increasingly narrow and idiosyncratic as well. It's mostly other highly educated, relatively affluent, urban and suburban white people who read the New York Times. They have a wider reach than a lot of other platforms, but it's pretty much the same group of people. And so, so for instance, when I try to make, if there's something that I'm concerned about, that I'm trying to get other people to pay attention to, what I often encourage people is to think about a wider spectrum of channels that they can try to. So I've done talks at RV parks for senior citizens. I've done talks at churches. I've done talks at libraries. I've done talks at local, I publish a lot with local media, which people are much more likely, which like local actors are much more likely to read, local stakeholders and so on. And so one of the things I would encourage people to do is kind of think about wider channels of influence other than the ones that are prestigious and kind of cool and whatever. And then the other thing, yeah, I mean, it's not just a problem for our impact, but even for trust in our institutions and for the, like, when people think, like a lot of people feel like they don't have a voice and they don't have a stake in our institutions, and that people like them are not represented in our institutions. This isn't misinformation by Fox News. This is a fact. It's actually a fact. Like they're right. They're correct. Like if you look at the media, for instance, in 1970, most journalists had college degrees, but it was only a slim majority. And like about 40% of journalists didn't have college degrees. And the people who did have degrees, they majored in a lot of different stuff. They came from a lot of different types of schools. You know, it's just a profession that people entered from a lot of different walks of life. Today, 95% of journalists have college degrees. And as more and more people have college degrees, where you get your degree matters more than ever. So places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have higher concentrations of Ivy League graduates than the Forbes 500 list. Or the Senate, the US Senate, has a lower concentration of Ivy League graduates than the New Republic. And this matters. This kind of shapes, like, if the goal of journalism is to hold the powerful to account, that mission plays out really differently when the powerful people you're supposed to be holding to account are your friends and your neighbors and your college buddies and your wife and, you know, people you go golfing with and so on. And more importantly, there's just a lot of research in the US and around the world that shows no matter what type of institution you're talking about, no matter where in the world you're looking at, when people feel like they don't have a voice in an institution, that they don't have a stake in an institution, that people like them are not represented in the institution, what they tend to do is they tend to mistrust that institution, and they're become much more likely to defund it, to want to dismantle it, especially if they feel like the people who run that institution are hostile towards people like them or hate people like them. And that's a perfect, like, we tend to describe that tendency in terms of anti-intellectualism and stuff like that. But it's actually a very rational response. If you don't have a voice or a stake in these institutions, and the people in them clearly seem to hate you and like demonize and villainize people like you constantly, it would actually be irrational to continue funding it, to collaborate with it, what, for your own demise, right? This is a perfectly reasonable, and so if we want to preserve, like if we want to not just increase the reach of our work or increase the efficacy of our work, but just increase trust in our institutions and help them continue to be viable in the foreseeable future. It's actually really important for us to address a lot of these social problems. The way I put it sometimes, and I'll stop talking, is right now in this moment, we have kind of two big challenges, those of us who work in the symbolic professions. On the one hand, a lot of our institutions are under attack. We do have to defend them. We do have to explain why the work we do matters, why the autonomy and so on that we enjoy should be preserved. But we've got to also, at the same time, acknowledge, publicly, acknowledge a lot of the ways in which our institutions, in fact, have not been representing and serving huge swaths of the country, the ways they haven't been living up to their ideals. And it's important to do both of these things at the same time. We have to walk and chew gum here. And the reason is, if people have concerns about our institutions, and they're presented with two narratives, basically. The one narrative is, there's nothing to see here. These institutions are great. Higher ed is great. Journalism's awesome. And the only reason you would think anything other than that is if you're stupid, brainwashed, racist, sexist. So if that's one narrative that people get. And the other narrative that people get is, you know what? You're right to be concerned. These institutions, they're actually not functioning the way they should. The people here, they don't trust you. They don't respect you. And you know what else? They're never going to fix themselves. They're never even going to acknowledge the problems, let alone address them. What you need to do is give someone like me a big sledgehammer, a big machete, and I'll beat these things into submission or burn them down. So if those are the two narratives that people get, that second one's going to win all day, every day, 6 ways to Sunday. And the reason that second narrative is going to win is because the first narrative, the nothing to see here narrative, actually affirms the second narrative, that we're never even going to acknowledge the problems, let alone address them. So it's really important, especially in this moment of crisis for a lot of our institutions, that we have to, we really do have to make a much more aggressive effort at reaching out to a wider range of stakeholders, acknowledging a lot of the ways our institutions have failed. There's not really an alternative as far as I see it.
Yeah, just like the effect when Hillary talked about the deplorables, that didn't have a very good effect, right? You got to reach to the people where they're at.
Absolutely.
Or nothing's going to.
So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you see the relationship of symbolic capitalism to non-symbolic capital. Because you talked about the contradiction for the symbolic capitalist between the interest in being elite and the interest in egalitarianism, but surely that contradiction is sharpest in a hyper-capitalist society, right? So how does, non-symbolic capital?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The book addresses that at length. I'll say as a kind of bookmark, as an immediate response until people check out the rest of the book. Like one of the narratives that became popular after Occupy Wall Street, especially, was this kind of framing of we are the 99%. There's the 99% and then there's the 1%, the millionaires and the billionaires, as Bernie Sanders put it, until he became a millionaire, and then it was just a bridge to billionaires. So there's this intense focus on the top 1%. The problem with that, and this is how I approached it too, as I'll initially, again, like I would have said, the millionaires and the billionaires and those damn Republicans. That was my kind of starting assumption. The problem, though, is that, for one thing, if you look at the top 1%, if you look at wealth, the top 1% controls about 27% of America's wealth. Now that's wild, that's huge. 1% controls more than a quarter. That is a wildly disproportionate percentage. But notice, the top 1% don't control most of America's wealth. They don't control anywhere near a majority of America's wealth. And so if you only focus on the top 1%, you miss the vast majority of wealth in America. Who has it? How is it exercised? In the service of what ends? And in fact, I'll just plug 2 books by other people, although you should buy my book first. There's this great book by Anand Giridharadas called Winners Take All. And what Giridharadas explores in that book is how the millionaires and the billionaires and multinational corporations, they create all of these social problems. in their myopic pursuit of wealth. They think quarter to quarter, they try to maximize profits, and this kind of reckless, maximalist approach to generating profits in the bottom line creates all these negative externalities. And then these same billionaires, through big philanthropy, end up painting themselves as the solution to the problems that they created, as making themselves seem like the heroes and not the villains. So again, it's a good book, buy mine first. But one of the things that's interesting, though, if you pay attention to that story that Jared Herodotus tells, is that the millionaires and the billionaires, they actually don't do much in that story. Like, who is it that's writing the press releases and the op-eds after these donations to help them avoid responsibility for blame and come to be seen as heroes? Like, is Jeff Bezos interviewing himself and then writing his own essay and then going on Twitter himself on the Washington Post channels and sharing it himself? No, that's us, journalists. We're the ones, symbolic capitalists are the ones who run the PR firms that help them launder their reputations. Symbolic capitalists are the ones who help them launder their money to avoid liability for blame and channel all this stuff into the nonprofit sector. Almost everything about that particular story that Jared Herodotus tells, almost every single step in the process, it's done with us and through us and couldn't happen without us. And so if we only focus on Jeff Bezos and not the people who are actually doing the things, then again, we miss who actually has power, how is that power exercised in the service of what ends. And the last thing I'll say, the other book I'll plug briefly, is Richard Reeves has this great book called Opportunity Hoarding. And one of the things he shows in that book is that if we want to understand a lot of social trends that we're concerned about, like growing inequality, declining social mobility, you actually can't explain a lot of these trends by just focusing on the top 1%. What he shows compellingly in that book, and which a lot of other research that I cite in my Substack and in my book also verifies, is that if you want to understand a lot of these negative social trends, you really have to look at the top quintile, the top 20%, the upper middle class, and the super rich. What he shows in that book is that it's opportunity hoarding by the upper middle class, creating these glass floors for our children, that is responsible for a lot of these negative externalities. Because if we want to make sure that our own kids reproduce our own social position or do even better than us while also preserving our own social position or trying to enhance it, if we create these glass floors for ourselves and our children such that we never go down, then eventually it becomes impossible for other people to come up either. And there needs to be dynamism and churn in order to have social mobility. If you prevent any downward mobility among elites, eventually upward mobility among normies also becomes basically impossible. And so the book does at length address, like, it is a critique of capitalism and the operation of and in fact, one of the core roles that we serve, as Barbara Ehrenreich argued back in her initial formulation of the professional managerial class, one of the key, or even as Marx, we can go back further. Marx created this distinction initially. Actually, he was probably the first one who created this distinction between the what he called the capitalists and the functioning capitalists. So the capitalists are the owners, the functioning capitalists are the people who run things, the separation of ownership and control. One of the things that Marx argued, and that lots of subsequent folks have also argued, is that, again, we play this central role in making things happen and also in justifying why things are the way they are, why they aren't the way they aren't. We play like this really pivotal role in legitimizing a lot of these kinds of things. And so it's actually impossible to understand even the dynamics of capitalism without paying attention to us, as Marx himself recognized, and as a lot of other people have recognized since.
Thank you. And in full disclosure, I am an alum and an attorney, so to quote the pop song, I'm the problem, it's me. No, but really my question is, and I think you were already barking up that trail, is, in what senses you mean the term symbolic capital or capitalism or capitalist. Because on the one hand, you could understand, to my mind, you could understand it in a sense of the symbol is the capital that the capitalist uses, right, to make themselves elite, et cetera. And at the same time, I could also conceive it as it's people using the symbol to justify the existence of capitalism, right, to perpetuate it. And so, and I'm, thinking along the lines of like Antonio Gramsci, like the Italian Marxist thinker, right, like developing consensus for the ruling class to have hegemony over the much larger subaltern class, right? And so really my question is, do you mean it in both senses, one or the other sense, or maybe a totally different sense?
Both.
Okay. Oh, that was easy.
That was a quick one. Love quick questions.
I have thank you for your talk. I have one question and one joke answer to the initial puzzle. The joke answer to the initial puzzle is, why is it that we still have all this, problems that the elites are supposed to solve, the capitalists are supposed to solve for us? Answer, those problems are really hard. Give us more money.
Yeah.
That's the joke. That's the joke answer. But I think that's
Well, that's also our sincere answer most of the time.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's why it's funny. But here's my sincere question. So if I understood the presentation correctly, for which again thank you, it looked like there was just a set of ideas, and these ideas sort of move through their own dialectic and sort of develop maybe slowly over time, but they're functionally stay the same over time. And these sets of ideas provide a kind of a gateway, and if you can't speak this way, then you're out, and if you can, then you're pretty good, and then if they change it and you don't change along with it, then you're out again, right? So all this kind of stuff that we've seen, and all this sort of engagement and the gatekeeping, et cetera. So my question is, great, why these particular ideas? Why is it that these, like it could be any sort of idea in principle, but as a matter of fact, it's these particular sort of, I mean, do you have thoughts about why it's those ideas?
Yeah. So that's one of the puzzles I take up in the book. It's one of the subordinate puzzles. So again, like one thing I'll note, by the way, one of the things that kind of also gave me an existential crisis is that there are some differences between cycle to cycle, but there's like an insane amount of similarity. Like things often like in the aftermath of the 1960s. So as was mentioned, I work with an organization called Heterodox Academy, which was created by which was co-founded by Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor at NYU. Okay, in the 1960s and 70s, there was also, in response to kind of the student protests and perceived illiberalism, there was also a New York University professor who created a large organization of academics who was trying to promote a lot of the same kinds of things. Now, the reason that organization doesn't exist today is because it turned out to be a front for the CIA. Heterodox Academy is not a front for the CIA, I can assure you. Or like Barbara Ehrenreich in her book Fear of Falling, which she wrote in the 90s. She was talking about, she has these great excerpts about how students in the 90s were being perceived and talked about using some of the exact same scripts that were mobilized against students in the 1960s. And then reading this in the 2010s, when these exact same scripts are being run again, this gave me a kind of vertigo. In fact, last thing I'll say, a lot of people think that this focus on identitarianism, race, gender, sexuality, ideas like intersectionality, they trace them broadly to the post-1960s period. But one of the things I show in the book is that actually all of the awakening episodes function in kind of the same way. So the very first awakening in the 1920s and 30s had the first wave of feminism. The first gay rights organizations were established. You had the New Negro movement, another anti-race, the first wave of anti-racism. George Orwell, writing at the tail end of that first awakening, writing in the 1930s, has this book called The Road to Wigan Pier, where he tries to explain why it is that working class people aren't down with socialism as they should be, according to, and one of the things he has these great quotes about how like the words communism and socialism, almost as if with magnetic force, draw to them every feminist, vegetarian, sexual deviant, fruit juice drinker, whatever. Like, it's this whole like list of. And what he argues in this book, in that book, is like one of the ways in which a lot of these movements go awry is that ultimately, all of these other people who are down with all of these other causes affix themselves to the socialist cause, and then it tries to be about all of these things and ends up accomplishing nothing on any of those fronts. And again, this kind of tendency to try to do all of them, to think that all of these causes are just convertible to each other, and that if you perceive there to be any tension or difference between these all good things that travel together, then you just must not understand things correctly and so on. A lot of these same tendencies are still pronounced today. Okay, so there's a lot of consistency in a way that was like really disturbing, and that I hope will disturb you too as you read it. Why these ideas? So that I alluded to there, but I elaborate a lot at the end of chapter 1. And what I argue is there's a kind of historically contingent explanation for that. So these professions, when they started to cohere in their recognizably modern form, again, they were dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, especially men, and the kind of social contract that was created at that time was basically that, look, we want this power, we want this resources, we want this autonomy. What we'll give you in exchange for that is that we'll leverage these privileges that you're giving to us to help everyone in society. So there's this kind of historically contingent set of claims and narratives that became popular within the symbolic professions at the time that they were being formed in their recognizably modern form. They weren't completely random because, again, they were downstream of this, of the social gospel movement. The composition of fields often shapes the kind of narratives that they're drawn to and the kind of claims that are made. And so that's like a very quick answer to, well, it wasn't that quick, but that's a relatively quick answer to that question.
Hi. So I grew up very working class. I moved to Manhattan like you, moved to LA, moved back home. I've gone through a very similar trajectory and thinking about a lot of these issues. And I really appreciate that you've given me language that I didn't really have before, which is great. I have some thoughts about how kind of we became what I would consider to be at the least an unproductive force in politics, and at the worst maybe a destructive force in politics. And I believe that it has to do with other trends that were happening at the time. And so I wanted to share some of those thoughts and just get your feedback on that. So I think sort of the creative class, if you will, the relationship between the rise of the symbolic capitalist with the rise of technology. The big growth market in the 2000s was technology. And suddenly storytellers and artists were like gold, right? We were the ones who could craft the narratives, and all the jobs were there for the people who could write, who could edit, who could photograph, who could design. And so the creative class kind of began our rise at the same time that unlimited money was being allowed into political campaigns. And so what I've observed is just how, as a creative person who makes my living online digitally, how much incentive there is to sort of be pulled into the politics of your party. And I think there's also been a creative class that has risen on the far right as well. And then, you know, you have the ability to make money through social media, through podcasting, et cetera, and ultimately we're being used to solidify the bases of the two parties. And then I think that there was also this trend in which we got so sucked into kind of an alternate universe of the digital world that we stopped focusing on the physical world. And so as a party, we stopped thinking about physical material needs. So you hear about unaffordable housing, and it's like we're a world that's being run by illusionists and not dealing with physical material realities.
Yeah, so I think, so a lot of that rings true for me, although I'd maybe extend the lens a bit. Like, so for instance, the fact that we don't really focus on material stuff as much as normie people. This is a long-standing social phenomenon that again, Orwell talks about in the 1920s. And the reason for that is because we take symbols very seriously. Our lives and our livelihoods are literally oriented around the production and manipulation of symbols. There's a lot at stake in this for us. We think that they're very important in a way that other people don't, because for us, they are just practically important. Like, they're actually literally important for us. And so for us, when we do a lot of these symbolic gestures, they seem really meaningful and important and significant. Like if we change the names on buildings or take down a monument or something, like that feels to us as if it's like a meaningful thing, even though other people are not so inclined to see it that way. You're absolutely right that most symbolic capitalists are associated with the left broadly, but there is a right-wing contingent among us, and there has been. And we tend to think we tend to think about social phenomena much the same way across the board, regardless of what political skew is. So if you look at the kind of anti-woke symbolic capitalists, like the way you arrive at the conclusion that a kerfuffle over Halloween costumes at Yale signals the decline of Western civilization, the only way that you can arrive at that kind of a conclusion is if you're someone who, again, takes symbols very seriously to the point where you think there's kind of world historical struggles at stake, it's cosmic, profound stakes. And you can see this. As you all know, there's been a new sheriff in town. There was an election. It didn't go the way most of us probably would have voted. But then look at how the Trump administration has decided to spend its time in office. They've spent a lot of time doing things like, oh, in DC, there's the Black Lives Matter street. Well, rather than going, oh, well, that was kind of a waste of resources, but it's sunk cost, let's just move on. They go, no, let's spend millions of dollars more tearing the dang thing up. Or, oh, they changed a lot of military bases away from the Confederate generals, the wokesters did. Well, you know what? We're gonna change them right back. We're gonna change the name of the Department of Army to the Department of War. We're gonna change the name of holidays and landmarks. It's not the Gulf of Mexico, it's the Gulf of America. It's not, there's even a kind of right-wing DEI movement, as I show in, that's kind of been aggressively promoted under this administration, favoring constituencies that are viewed as being more congenial towards Republicans. And so they tend to think about politics and approach politics in the same way. In fact, one of the things I flag to people a lot, so in a lot of anti-woke spaces, you hear people say things like, Eremex candy, boo. I support the Martin Luther King style approach to anti-racism. And it's like, oh, cool. All right, well, out of curiosity, are you organizing or participating in any Martin Luther King style social movements to address poverty, resist war, deal with the remaining racialized inequalities in America? To which the answer is always no. They're sitting in their keyboard going, about wokeness, and using that as a stand-in for substantive political action, which is another way of saying they're not doing anything any different than the people that they're criticizing. They're engaged in the same kind of symbolic struggle over words and symbols and stuff. And, the last thing I'll say, so again, kind of widening the temporal horizon. You're absolutely right that there is these kind of changes in organizational structure and technology play a big role in explaining our rise and our social role. But what you can see, what I argue in the book, is you can start to see our ascendancy and a lot of these tendencies that we have today, starting in the period between the world wars. And the reason for that is at the time that the symbolic professions were being formulated, and especially during that period, there were these dramatic changes, like the scale and complexity of a lot of organizations became much bigger. in a way that required more people who were administrators and experts and professionals and all of that in order to allow those institutions to function on the kinds of scales that they were. And so so you're absolutely right to point to these changes in technology and organizational structure. The only amendment, the friendly amendment that I would give is I think the story goes back a little bit further, starting in the interwar period in my own accounting. Yep.
I suggest lightning round with these last two questions.
You mean lightning round answers? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do
If we're going to have any time for you down
12.
You got it. All right. Thanks again for coming out here today. So my question for you is, do you think that these institutions, symbolic capitalists, academia, are missing the mark on who they're actually trying to help? Because it seems to me that this book could also be called "We Have Never Met a Worker," or we forgot we were workers.
Yeah.
And I think that these trends that you talk about too are also coincide with labor very heavily. The 20s, the 60s, and the early 90s with NAFTA, and then 2010, maybe not so much strong labor movements, but a strong drive towards the populism, as we say. So if you could just respond to that.
Okay, I can do that quickly. Cool. So one thing I'll point to is I have this essay that I published right after the 2024 election called "A Graveyard of Bad Election Narratives," that addresses a lot of the popular narratives after Kamala lost. That was like, oh, she lost because the billionaires bought the election and racism and all this kind of stuff. What I show is like the empirical basis for that is not actually that robust. But one thing that's really interesting that I show here and I show in the book and that I'm going to show a lot in my next book called "Those People," is that, so one of the key arguments of my next book is that a lot of the political divides that people talk about today, the urban-rural divide, the diploma divide, the growing gender divide in politics, the racial de-alignment in politics, these are all fronts in a deeper schism, which is increasingly between people and communities that are tied to the knowledge professions and people who aren't. Communities and industries and stakeholders that are producing physical goods and services to people, their needs are not central to a lot of our policy making. And you're absolutely right. In fact, okay, this isn't short. But the last thing I'll say on this, one of the ways I think activism has gone awry, has gone really, really awry since the 60s, is that if you look at the 1950s, you had groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. They would organize on campus in support of the civil rights movement. But they would organize on campus in order to do demonstrations in the world alongside normie people who were not academics. That is not the structure of activism today. Increasingly, activism today, like the students will organize a protest on campus and then carry out that protest on campus, and the demands will be something tied to the campus. We want the university president to make a statement, as if like take the contestation, like the campaigns in a lot of universities to have university presidents take a stand on the Israel, on the war on Gaza. Now you could have the university president read the most radical statement that you could possibly write, and they could read that statement with the purest fervor of their heart, and it would not save one person's life. Like, there's just a complete lack of correspondence between the things that people are doing and the things they say they want to accomplish. And other demands are like, change the curriculum, look at the university investment portfolio. Like, it's just like narcissistically focused on us and our communities and our institutions. Like, almost all of the activism is just by us, for us, about us. And it's like people who are not us are just, they're just like they literally don't factor in. I start my book with this, okay, I apologize, Walter. I start my book with this anecdote at Columbia University. Where I started at Columbia shortly before Trump was elected. After Trump was elected, all of these folks said they were too traumatized by the election to do their tests and their homework and so on. They wanted all these accommodations, and the university, of course, was like, oh, yes, of course, here you go. Okay. But the thing about it is, there are all of these other workers who are around the students. The people who serve them food, the people who cut the hedges, the people who clean the buildings. Absolutely. And there was no movement on behalf of those workers. And those were the workers who, in the students' own telling of what was at stake in that election, it was, you know, the Columbia students are disproportionately from good off backgrounds, and if you came to Columbia and you're not well off, you'll leave Columbia just fine. Whereas the people who do a lot of these other jobs are more likely to be immigrants, more likely to be minorities, or more likely to be less affluent background people. The people that the students said they were concerned about, that they were so upset about. But they were literally invisible. There was just like no accounting at all for these other workers. Yeah, it drives me, anyway, long story short, it drives me batty, especially because, again, like, what I was doing before I became an Ivy League intellectual is I was doing freight, I was doing, like, these other kinds of jobs. And it, especially because if we want to understand both the rise of Trump and other populist movements, and a lot of other phenomena that we're concerned about, like, again, one of the big things that drives it is precisely this, that our institutions are not concerned with huge swaths of America, that they're literally invisible to us, and to the extent that they become visible, it's for us to like criticize and sneer and condescend to them and stuff like that. And this is not sustainable. It's just not sustainable.
Thank you.
Yep.
St. John's dropout, welfare alum, and unlicensed contractor in Santa Fe.
Okay. You got the last word, and I'll make it quick.
I am,
God willing.
I'm an alum. And whenever I read a book, and I've read the introduction to your book because I just learned about your book, so I've risen to that level of incompetence and confidence that produces this question. How would you distinguish this concept of symbolic capitalists? And I have a real problem with the term capitalist applied to symbols, but how would you distinguish that from the age-old concept of the intelligentsia that were the learned in a society and were profoundly effective, often in that society, so effective that Mao killed them all because they were trouble? How is this concept different than the concept that has always been there, that the intelligentsia doesn't really participate in the political process very much? Those people in the intelligentsia are dedicated to the life of the mind or creativity or telling the truth, things that have nothing to do with necessarily political action. And instead, what their goal is to create and grow a conceptual vocabulary for others to deal with reality as it's presented. And then it is the job of politicians, who are good at it, to constitute the connection between those concepts and then how the economy can be designed.
Yeah, okay,
And-
so
and-
I think, so how I would respond quickly, is that, okay, so there's two things. First, if you look at who's most likely to participate in politics in America today, actually it's highly educated, relatively affluent people who are tied to the symbolic professions. They're more likely to donate, they're more likely to campaign, they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to do any kind of political action that you can think of. Actually, we're the people who are most likely to do it. So we're not actually kind of remote people who are diverse from politics. We're the most politically active constituency in the country today. And even if you look at politicians, so not only are we politically active, but in virtue of consolidating ourselves in one political party and being so active and having a lot of resources under our control, we've basically captured one of the main political parties completely, such that it's really focused on us and our narratives, and in a way that puts them increasingly out of step with the rest of America. And you can see this, I don't have that graph there. Okay, well, you can see this in public attitude polling. You can see this in the Democratic Party platform. The Democratic Party has grown, as it's become more oriented on us and matching our trends and our preferences, it's become increasingly divorced from the median voter and the rest of the country and so on. And then last thing I'll say is within that political party, most of the actual politicians are us. So fun fact, every symbolic capitalist since, every single Democratic nominee since Jimmy Carter has been a symbolic capitalist. In fact, they've been every successful nominee on the Democratic side has been one type of symbolic capitalist, lawyer. And then, Al Gore was a journalist, God bless him. But so not only, and we have symbolic capitalists control one entire branch of government, the Supreme Court. And if you look at the Constitution of Congress, who dominates Congress, about 70% of contemporary Congress people, and an even higher percentage on the Democratic side, are drawn from our professions, actually. So we are not disconnected people who observe and create things for ordinary people and other stakeholders to engage with. One of the changes from the intelligentsia kind of framework of previous eras is that in the contemporary context, we're rolling up our sleeves, we're the ones running the show, calling the shots, making things happen. We are knee-deep in politics aggressively in a way that was maybe less common in the past.
So, Musa, we'll get you down to the bookstore for a few minutes. Please join me in
And I'm happy to talk more downstairs.